This time around, I'll be making a liminal space playset, while also exploring what on earth liminal spaces have to do with the media we consume. Some of you will already know that this topic is no stranger to this channel, but this might actually be the final installment of a very inadvertent trilogy. First, I needed a case for everything, and making the case first would help to determine the size of everything else. I really wanted to avoid adding to my yarn collection and just things in general, so I'm only using materials I already have for this project, including as many scrap yarns as I can manage, so if you see some odd combinations, that's why. The yarn I'm using for the case is some untreated wool, this is relevant, that I used to develop my shorts pattern. I did unravel the yarn a long time ago, so it has stretched out quite a bit, but that won't be an issue here. I decided to crochet it since denser crochet stitches tend to hold the structure a lot better than knit, though in hindsight I totally could have knit it instead. Single crocheting in the round as I've chosen to do here can come with some twisting, so this was a bit of a gamble. The twist was certain, but the problem had yet to be confirmed. I could have worked the waistcoat stitch instead, but I chose speed and ease this time. The small but compounding extra effort just wasn't for me in this specific case. Speaking of the case, you're probably wondering what it's supposed to look like. At first, I thought that maybe an old school CRT computer monitor would be cool, and I still think that it would have been a very spacious and on-theme option. The problem was, I wasn't keen on how it would function. I had my heart set on a clamshell opening like the classic Polly Pockets, and a monitor seemed awkward in that sense. So after some more thought, I finally came up with something that might actually be better. A giant beige keycap. Not only was it a close alternative, but the much simpler shape would also make my life a lot easier moving forward. The only trouble was figuring out which keycap it was going to be. There were certainly some strong contenders. The delete key. This one is practically a meme already, so enough said. The end key. A useful key with strong messaging, but it's easy to forget it exists, which is, regressively, quite profound. The home key made a lot of sense in terms of a playset, just not this playset. The Z key, an initial on its own, but also the computer equivalent of frogging when used with control. Of course, I'd need 2 keys for it to really work, and this was already going to be one long video. Alas, despite how fitting all of these had the potential to be, none of them were as perfect as the escape key. Which brings me to the topic at hand. Since you have already graced this video with your wonderful presence, you probably already know what liminal spaces are. But in case you're unfamiliar, liminal spaces are scenes, settings, and places which often embody elements of nostalgia, emptiness, but most importantly, a state of limbo, suspended in the aesthetics of transition, in between departure and destination. Popular examples are office spaces, abandoned malls, hotel hallways, cinema lobbies, and even swimming pools. Although the following doesn't define a liminal space, a sense of nostalgia is often needed to evoke that soul-wrenching wistfulness that defines their collective online appeal. So you'll often find that said spaces are quite dated, hence the popular liminal space genre, analog horror, as opposed to digital horror. Though that time is certainly coming, if it's not already here. Before we know it, quantum horror will have us screaming in 2 places at once, which can only mean double the fun. Long story short, liminal spaces, like playsets, provide us with a form of escapism. If a social media post is liminal, but no one's there to say it is, does it even exist? Even though we may not have any desire to visit the physical space itself, the feeling of time standing still and the ability to revisit and even exist in the past are part of the core appeal of liminal spaces. In other words, escape is anywhere but here. But as we'll soon explore, escape doesn't have to be to a physical or even virtual place. Before we go any further, Now that I've completed the 2 crochet pieces for the keycap, it's time to introduce some much needed chaos into the equation, because I was going to felt this entire thing, and since I didn't plan on risking it all, at least not this time, I wasn't going down the machine felting route. This would be when you throw your work in progress into the washing machine and cross every finger, toe, and even your eyes staring at the cycle, hoping for the desired outcome. Naturally, the more experienced machine felters would be able to leave and come back whenever they felt like it. Since I still needed to figure out what to do, I made a swatch. And the conclusion was that needle felting first, followed by wet felting by hand, gave a safe balance between result and control. And I think you can tell that the spot where I tried needle felting first actually looks the best. The shrinkage was minimal, so I didn't expect the resulting fabric to be tightly structured like I would with a machine felting. Theoretically, crocheting larger pieces and then machine felting them would have given me the ideal outcome. That said, I'd never felted a project before, and there's still a lot more for me to learn about it, so I played it safe, especially since it's the least reversible thing ever. If it were to go wrong, then I'd have had to rethink the whole case since I didn't have enough yarn to repeat with. This process took a lot longer than I expected, and some things were either more or less effective than I'd hoped, but I definitely learned a lot and was pretty happy with the result. Things did end up shrinking slightly, and it turned out my initial swatch wasn't accurate at all because I didn't use water that was hot enough or agitate it for very long. Anyway, since this was a super long and somewhat chaotic process, I've posted an in-depth commentary on it over on Patreon, so definitely check it out if you're interested in seeing how things went down and what I learned from the ordeal. A massive thank you to all my members and supporters, I really appreciate you. With most of the case now complete, it was time to begin working on the inside. Since I was already set on what I wanted to do for the bottom half, that's the half I started with. But before I could really get going, I needed to figure out the colours and pattern first, because nothing screams backrooms quite like tiled surfaces. That's an exaggeration, but let's just go with it. Naturally, single crocheting would give me a good amount of coverage, which was important for a project this structured. First, I went with a colour combination more in line with a warmer backrooms palette, hence the grey and beige. The beige was from my Drive Jacket project earlier this year, and I figured it would match the outer casing well. However, even though I thought the combination was fine, it didn't quite give the vibe I was looking for. So next, I tried a more cool-toned approach with a blue grid on white. These are the same colours I used for my Vaporwave vs Synthwave flame shirt from my previous liminal space related video. I thought the white and blue worked best, but the grid proportions needed some adjusting. White and grey was an option, but I'll explain why I didn't go with this later on. If you're familiar with liminal space aesthetics, you probably know where this is going, or at the very least, you have a good chance of guessing. I am indeed crocheting a swimming pool for the bottom half of the case, which, compared to other famous liminal spaces, has always seemed like a bit of an odd one out to me. It also doesn't help that it's a recurring setting in weirdcore aesthetics. The first question you might ask is, what makes a swimming pool liminal? Sure, it's transitional in the sense that you don't hang around in it forever, and it's liminal in the same way that an empty playroom or play center is. But there's just something exceptionally eerie about swimming pools. About thousands upon thousands of gallons of chemically treated water sitting in what is essentially giant ceramic Tupperware. It is, by definition, wholly unnatural. Maybe it's a crocodile part of my brain that's still suspicious of stagnant water. Maybe it's the use of swimming pools as a horror trope. But there's just something so ominous about a still body of water that, at its deepest depths, isn't all that safe a place. Anyway, this brings us to the main subject of today's video. Yes, that was quite a build-up, so I'll get straight to the point. Something that's been on my mind a lot more than usual lately is the media we consume, and perhaps more importantly, our relationship with it. It's another form of recreation that, Like pool water, we immerse ourselves into, only to climb out of it once we decide to move on to something else. I was brushing my teeth in the early hours of a Saturday morning when it occurred to me just how weird that is. Like, we just nonchalantly dive into the engineered sounds, emotions, and lived experiences of an artist we may never have even shared a room, let alone a conversation with. And then just stop, whenever we feel like it, no matter the time of day, or even where we are. All courtesy of some brand spanking new technology, spanning not even a blip of human history. So many of us are listening to the same tunes, creating very similar yet also very different memories with them. Okay, so it's deep, we get it, but how is any of this liminal? If we're being pedantic, it's because everything is liminal. But on a less pedantic note, our experience of art, be it music, books, or movies, is limited, which means that the space in between their beginning and end is liminal. The time we spend immersed in them is liminal. It's cooling off in a swimming pool on a hot summer's day. So, despite how eerie and scary liminality can seem, especially as it's portrayed in the aesthetic, we clearly still love and enjoy liminal things, even if, and especially when, they don't last forever. They still transport us somewhere else. They allow us to escape. Even The Neverending Story didn't quite live up to its title. Actually, I have no idea what the story was or if it ever truly ended, because I was too skeptical to read it as a child. It was a big book, and it gave big disappointment energy. Sometime after finishing this crochet swimming pool, I was reminded of Kendrick Lamar's piece Swimming Pools from his 2012 studio album Good Kid, Mad City. The song is a real banger, but more than that, to no one's surprise, it carries a deep meaning. His lyrics describe a surreal image of diving into a pool of liquor, a metaphor for his spiral into dependency. The surrounding lyrics and chorus describe the influence of his environment and pressure from peers leading him further downwards. The pool of liquor not only symbolizes the depths of his spiral, but also the escapism he sought from the very same. I'm not comparing media consumption to the subject matter of this song. What I am saying is that Lamar's use of the swimming pool as a metaphor was a sound one. No pun intended. The swimming pool is a place you can dive into, swim, float, or drown in. As fun as it has the potential to be, it can be equally, if not more dangerous, the deeper and longer you go beneath the surface. And with these lyrics being as poetic and meaningful as they are, it's honestly jarring to think how many of us, including myself, have listened to this track on repeat, completely lacking the appropriate context, emotion, or attention so far as the lyrics themselves are concerned. Even ignoring them altogether because it just sounds good. Because it does. Sound waves and water waves may as well be the same thing, as we exist alone in our personal, hermetically sealed swimming pools, fully immersed in our self-centered experience. I think I just described what brains are. I guess they too are temporary, limited, and self-absorbed. It's time to fill this pool with water, or cerebrospinal fluid if we're being fancy and carrying the metaphor. So the reason I went with a light blue instead of grey for the grid was because I realized that I already had two close to perfect colours for the water. These light teal and dark turquoise cotton yarns would match with the tile pattern to create the illusion of pool water reflecting blue light. I hadn't used either of these yet since I got them with a specific project in mind, so these were the first fresh yarns I used. The idea was to create a cuboid of water in a way that was reminiscent of isometric art, except it would technically be three-dimensional. But that's not all, because I think most of us can agree that one of the best parts about playsets has always been the interactivity. So although it would have made for a cool pincushion, I wanted to make a zippable pouch instead. I wanted a place to keep all my favorite albums, movies, and TV shows of all time, in spirit, of course. You might be wondering why I was working flat instead of just working up the sides in the round. Like with the pool base, working in the round had some twist, which usually isn't that bad at this scale, but the grid pattern made it really obvious that the stitches leaned forward. So even though it wasn't as straightforward, ironically enough, crocheting everything flat first was the only way I could keep the grid lines vertical without switching to a different stitch altogether. Many of you may remember that I recently put out some polls asking you which kinds of media you would choose if you could only choose one forever. For the YouTube community poll, the options were streaming, CDs and DVDs, cassettes and VHS tapes, and vinyl and film reels. However, on Instagram stories, I made two separate polls, one for music and the other for shows and movies. I did this because I also wanted to know what your preferences were when it came to audio and visual media separately. And I have to say, I was surprised by the results, but I was even more surprised about how different they were across platforms. On YouTube, physical media was king. Over 70% of you chose CDs and DVDs, with streaming coming in far behind at under 20%. Even though 4% of you chose vinyl and film reels, I'm going to assume that it was probably more about the vinyl than the film, since I don't know that I've ever actually seen film reels being used in real life. Seriously though, I don't know that I ever have. I have a particularly soft spot for tapes, so it made me quite happy to see that 7% of you went with cassettes and VHS tapes. It may not seem like a lot, but given the other options, I think it's significant. Now here's where things got even more interesting, because over on Instagram, streaming actually won in both categories, with discs quite close behind, though DVDs were actually more popular than CDs. Vinyl being the most popular out of the remaining options also makes a lot of sense since their popularity has stayed pretty consistent over the last couple of decades. I thought it was also quite cool that VHS and cassette tapes performed the same across all polls. Of course, some will say that a number of votes will have come from the same people across both platforms, and to that I would say that I honestly appreciate the enthusiasm. Again, I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but I really wasn't expecting such differing results, so if you did, thank you very much for taking part. In terms of how the water turned out, I wasn't that happy with it. I think I could have done with sizing down the measurements even more than I already had. Somehow, even though I purposely made the water shallower than the pool, it still managed to look level with the pool edges. Either the gauges were more different than I thought, since I used recycled yarn for the pool and new yarn for the water, or the zipper added more height than I anticipated. And I'm going to go with this explanation because the grid seemed to line up just fine. I couldn't reasonably expect perfect edges with crocheted cotton alone, so I just had to accept that things didn't look as impossible as I would have liked them to. The zipper needed to be sewn down some more, so I did that later. But yeah, it wasn't bad enough for me to spend another eternity making corrections, so I just left things as they were. Of course, there's more to say about physical media, so while we explore this topic further, I'll be returning to the outer case to add the crucial finishing touches to actually make it into a functioning case. If you watched my Frutiger Aero video from earlier this year, you may recall me mentioning a certain Bon Iver CD and how it used to play as my morning alarm. Well, I kept thinking about that CD long after the video was done. It's a good no-skip album in my opinion, but it wasn't the music I was thinking about. It was the memory of the physical disc playing the first sounds I'd hear each day. It was a comforting constant at a time when a lot was changing in my life, as tends to be the case when you're young. And without hesitation, thoughts crossed my mind about how I could replicate that feeling again, or at least experience something similar. First, I had to find this CD, because until then, this nostalgia was lostalgia. That's probably the worst one so far. Eventually, and I really mean eventually, I did end up finding some of my old CDs, but far from all of them. Fortunately, I did manage to uncover the CD that started it all. And naturally, I went back in time and listened to it, all the way through, which was something only reserved for my most favorite albums of all time when streaming, and rarely. Suffice it to say, I really did feel something. It's hard to describe, but I'll try my best. First of all, it was kind of similar to the feeling that liminal spaces give, mostly in the sense that it felt like going back to a time that didn't exist anymore, one that had long passed but still existed perfectly somewhere light years away, yet simultaneously flawed in my own degraded memory. The CD, on the other hand, was perfectly the same. The thing is, this feeling wasn't rose-tinted, although unmistakably it did feel simpler. My listening experience felt less clouded, less distracted, undisturbed by the chaos of my playlists. There was a familiar yet distant sense of clarity. Obviously, I had to play my other CDs as well, and soon began to notice that things literally sounded better too. Even though I thought this was probably some kind of placebo effect brought on by the memories of my youth, chances are it wasn't, which is something I'll get into shortly. What remained the biggest takeaway from this brief nostalgia trip was that I realized that streaming has always been, and remains, the antithesis to all of this. And I had to ask myself, was it actually that bad? Did the last decade and a half really sound and feel worse? Was it the fault of streaming, or just how I used it? With all this said, it's worth exploring the pros and cons of streaming versus physical media, and for this video, I'll be focusing on the ones that received the most votes, which are CDs, DVDs, and streaming. While researching all of this, I ended up learning a bunch of new things I either didn't know or just never even thought about until now, so my hope is that you also gain some mild enlightenment from this part of the video. And if not, then please enjoy me calling you a clever clogs in the nicest way possible.
Oh, you clever clogs, you.
And of course, if there are any points I don't end up mentioning, please feel free to share yours with us in the comments. So here goes. One of the things I never paid any attention to was that CDs have actually been significantly better than some music streaming services when it comes to audio quality. You may or may not be horrified to hear that I haven't subscribed to a music service in many years, which means that most of the music I've been streaming this whole time has been around 160 to 256 kilobits per second. Don't get me wrong, this doesn't equate to terrible audio, for most people anyway, but it's nowhere near CD quality at a bitrate of 1411 kbps. Of course, if you're subscribed to a service, then the audio quality you're getting is going to be higher than the free options, but unless you've been tinkering with your app settings or paying for a more premium service, chances are that you've also been listening to lower than CD quality audio over the past decade, if not two. Most likely at somewhere around 320 kbps. Sure, streaming is convenient to use, but lower quality compressed audio files are also more convenient to stream. Even if you have access to lossless streaming, which is a lot more common nowadays, you'll still have to deal with higher storage, data, and battery usage, which kind of chips away at the convenience aspect. Now, unless you've got the right kind of gear, setup, and listening environment, because listening to music in a quiet room isn't the same as blasting it on the subway, the difference isn't that noticeable, if at all, and I'm assuming this is why the difference isn't talked about more. Though I really hope I don't get any flag for saying this. So it turns out I wasn't just imagining things. My old CDs really do sound better than my new playlists, and I personally found that it improved my listening experience to a point where I was just playing songs to actually listen to them, and not just for background noise. And of course, when it comes to DVDs, movies can come in different qualities depending on what kind of disc you buy. You just need to make sure that you have the right players to watch them with. Having your own personal collection means there's less decision fatigue compared to having the world's library at your fingertips. Plus, if you're spending quite a bit on albums or movies, chances are they're the ones you really like. I've also found that just listening to an album in full helps to keep things simple, and you get to experience the art as the artists intended. There's also nothing like rewatching the same slightly obscure DVDs as a kid because that's all you had apart from whatever was on TV. Some core memories were truly formed back then, and I really can't say the same for streaming. Although you could also say I also wasn't streaming as a child, so that's probably why, but I would beg to differ. Of course, this was something you also pointed out under the YouTube poll, so shout out to everyone who commented. I really related to a lot of what you said, so some of this will likely sound familiar. Since discs are physical items, you also get the benefit of their physical presence in your living space, which, depending on your taste in interior decor, might be cool. They also come with additional artwork and lyrics, which is always cool. When it comes to the tangible aspect, this wasn't really a thing back then, but I think a lot of us miss the ritual of playing CDs in a CD player. It felt like more of a faff back in the day, but in the same way that we've come to love mechanical keyboards over the low-profile ones, there is a tactile value to playing discs over tapping screens and clicking mice. And how can we forget that once you purchase a CD or DVD, it's yours. No faceless organization can take it away from you without actually committing a crime. It's yours to do with as you please, and you can even use it as a coaster if you want to. One thing I really miss is the extra and exclusive content that used to come with DVDs. Often on a separate disc, the special features were sometimes more fun than the film itself after a while. Of course, DVDs can also be interactive, and these are two major things that streaming hasn't replicated as much, or as well, if at all. I mean, where are the behind-the-scenes edits, the creator commentary, or even the bloopers? YouTube? And since the disc is the storage, there's no worrying about running out of space on your device. This way, you can really escape all the user surveillance and AI-driven noise plaguing so many platforms and apps today. What physical media may lack in physical freedom, i.e. convenience, it more than makes up for in freedom of experience and, moreover, privacy. And at last, but by no means least, artists do tend to see a higher amount of the proceeds from CD sales than from streaming royalties. And in a world where artists are barely getting by from their actual art, that's a big deal. Let's not forget that back when movie makers could actually rely on DVD sales, studios were willing to take more risks with movies such as Good Will Hunting, as explained by Matt Damon himself. And this kind of begs the question, should a system that requires mass consumption for artists to survive off their craft and create freely be upheld? It's kind of wild to think that consuming physical copies would be the more ethical option today in this context, though it's not at all surprising. So maybe buying secondhand or pre-owned is better for the environment, but in this specific context, it seems that buying new physical media is the only way to substantially support less well-known artists and creatives. And even then, you can still argue that it's simply not enough. And just so we're clear, this is only within the context of streaming versus CDs and DVDs. There are of course other ways to support your favorite artists. Now it's time to get deeper into the cons. Physical media can get really expensive, especially if you're buying brand new. And of course, if you're looking to buy pre-owned, then you're limited to what's available. So although it can be a fun activity, you might find it hard to rely on for the things you really want. Something I was reminded of when trying to unearth my old CDs is that even a handful of them can take up a lot of space, which in this day and age is premium real estate. So unless you've got a bunch of room to spare, collecting physical media may not be your idea of ideal. Plus, whatever you do have in your collection will need to be stored and handled properly, because CD rot is a thing, not to mention cracked cases and scratched discs. With the world having fallen more and more out of love with discs over the last decade or so, a lot of smaller artists and even bigger ones nowadays will either release limited physical media or just none at all, likely due to initial cost and low demand. And it's odd to think about how many movies and platform originals will never have the privilege of ever being released onto DVD. Let's not forget that to even enjoy these artifacts, you'll need a CD or DVD player, or at the very least a disk drive for your laptop or PC. Before we get to the next part, it's a no-brainer that I needed some form of reinforcement for the felted pieces. So since I still had quite a bit of EVA foam left over from my one and only footwear project, I decided to use it to create an underlying structure for the wall to fit over. The only problem was figuring out how to hold it all together. Again, I only wanted to use things I already had, and I didn't have the right kinds of tape or glue. So after some trial and error, I figured I'd try and see if I could pretend the foam was leather by punching holes in it and then stitching everything together using the baseball stitch, which, as you probably guessed, is the one you find on baseballs. With this being my first time trying this stitch, I was cautiously optimistic, but prepared to accept some less than perfect results given the less than orthodox circumstances. Now let's move on to streaming, which I imagine is what most people are on nowadays. For the pros, the biggest one is convenience. Since your playlists and favorites are cached and downloaded onto your devices, you're not only free to switch between said devices, but streaming offers freedom outside of a physical media collection and any dedicated players, which nowadays are pretty much the opposite of convenient. So streaming really is ideal if you live a relatively nomadic lifestyle. And this brings me to access. With modern streaming, you now have access to endless libraries of media you would never even think to search for. I remember how big a deal this was back in the day when we first started to discover what music streaming was. And yes, I still recall the time when Spotify was invite only, and people said things like, "Have you heard about Spotify?" I don't quite remember early Netflix in the same way, but again, the idea of having so much available to you all at once, without having to spend all your disposable cash on only a few albums or DVDs, was truly mind-blowing. It also seemed too good to be true because of how much of a leap it was. After all, it was still cheaper than renting. RIP Blockbuster, how I miss your blockbusting ways. But not really, because returning those movies in person was actually so annoying. Another pro would be personalization, and this is kind of a double-edged sword as you're probably already thinking, but in terms of the positives, having things served to you saves you from having to look for them. Honestly, there are too many artists I probably never would have discovered otherwise. It can be argued that streaming offers a lot more exposure for up-and-coming artists that they just wouldn't have otherwise. But there are caveats, especially with how companies often design and use their algorithms to favor more popular artists. And of course, there's original and exclusive content that's specific to individual platforms, which is basically cable TV reincarnated. And I don't know, this kind of sounds like a con, but what kind of con? I'll leave you to decide. As you may have already guessed, there was a reason the pool placement was off-center. The reason being that I wanted to add something else, another somewhat interactive element. And I knew from the very beginning that I wanted a seating area, just like any decent playset would have, according to my memory, at least. I just had to decide what I wanted it to look like. Long story short, the image of a generic brown sofa ticked the right boxes for me. It was mundane, familiar, nostalgic, and liminal. A brown sofa reminded me of the Simpsons sofa. I guess this is just one of those things that makes the most sense within this liminal series as a whole, so if you know, you know. But more than anything, sofas or couches have proven to be such iconic settings in so many nostalgic sitcoms and TV shows that it only made sense. The sofa is a meta in and of itself, a place where you can escape into faraway, even fictional worlds where other people and characters also sit on their sofas and watch TV. Does art imitate life, or does life imitate art? The answer is neither, because when it comes to being a couch potato, life is art. In terms of cons, streaming of course often relies on harvesting your data to not only serve you suggestions, but also use it to tailor certain features like shuffle, even though from what I can see, nobody actually wants this. And this is the nice stuff. The other stuff would be using our data for targeted advertising and sharing it with those ominous third parties we know nothing about. And it's not just our taste in genres so they can feed us more slop. It's data about our actual behavior, devices, location. In other words, it's stuff that helps them more than us. This is just standard practice nowadays, but just because it's normal doesn't mean it's okay. Another related con is that recommendations are, in my experience, pretty bad at least more than half of the time, so I guess even though they are harvesting our data, they're either just doing a really bad job of using it, or they're being very sneaky about it. Ironically, or not really, a con that I wish we never stopped talking about is, again, decision fatigue. In essence, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. Too much choice wears us down to playing the same 5 tracks over and over until we eventually discover 5 more to replace them with. Or watching the same comfort movie on repeat because dedicating a couple of hours to a bad movie feels almost as bad as giving up on it and wondering how it ended. With so much available to us, why on earth would we go back and appreciate the good old stuff? Unless it's new, good old stuff. Spoiled for choice never sounded so real. Why rent the world when we only need a roof over our heads? Because one of the biggest arguments I've heard made over and over is that subscription services are basically just renting. And like landlords, companies can raise the prices whenever and by however much they choose, which means that your ad-free playlists and movies only get more expensive to enjoy, unlike more traditional media and file purchases, which will always be however much you paid for them. Renting also means that your favorite songs and movies can simply disappear. And it's happened, but unless you're a Neil Diamond fan or a Swiftie, you probably didn't care that much about it over the last decade. Most of us are probably more miffed that the streaming platform movie carousel is constantly moving. Surely it's not meant to be that literal. Having a movie stop playing midway through because it's no longer available is the equivalent of someone setting fire to a book you were in the middle of reading. Has the destruction of the Library of Alexandria taught us nothing? Finally, and perhaps most importantly, if you're paying for a streaming service, you're actively supporting whatever corporations and their CEOs choose to do with your hard-earned money. But now that there are more streaming services than ever before, you have more choice than ever before. Alternatively, you can just use the free versions of streaming apps or watch free streaming sites. There's certainly a lot more on offer now than ever before. Remember, you do not fear ads. Ads fear you. Maybe it's the knitting and crochet, but I've personally found that they're not that annoying when you're not even paying attention. Do we consume media, or does media consume us? I'd also like to take a moment to give a brief overview of the other physical media types. When it comes to tapes, vinyl, and film, the analog appeal is undeniable. Even though most modern vinyl records are pressed using digital masters, the ritual of playing a physical record and watching it spin is very cool. And how will people know how legitimate you are as an audiophile if you don't have your walls lined with LPs? But of course, what these all have in common is the problem of degradation. Tapes are notoriously fickle when it comes to playing them, I too recall trying to wind up cassettes with pencils and ballpoint pens. And just so we're clear, cassettes were still in use by the 2000s, so don't get it twisted. Seriously, you might break it. I also recently learned that not only are vinyl records easily warped, but you actually damage them slightly with every play, which, as romantic as it sounds, is equally horrifying. Worse yet, I had no idea that PVC records were actually toxic. It's not too clear just how toxic when playing and storing them, but they're difficult to recycle and disposing of them is pretty bad for the environment. Fortunately, it seems that parts of the industry are acknowledging this, and hopefully sustainable alternatives will become more popular sooner rather than later, even if we're here for a good play, not a long play. I think it's safe to say that if collecting more obscure or old media is for you, chances are you've already started and need no convincing either way. They truly are the most immersive, in my opinion. But if you were just thinking about it, it might be worth some more consideration before you really commit. In conclusion, obviously, all of these different ways to enjoy audio and visual media are valuable, but in different ways. Only you can decide which pros are most important to you, and which cons are the least bothersome. However, one option I didn't include in the poll that I really wish I had is perhaps one of the better options we have today when it comes to music, depending on what you're looking for, of course, and that is purchasing digital audio files online. Depending on where you get them from, they can come in lossless audio formats, and it's always worth checking if this is important to you. This way, you avoid the downsides of collecting physical media, while also supporting artists more than you would through streaming alone. And unless you're listening to a lot of new music each month, it can work out to a similar cost, if not less. And you get to own the files. Put them on your phone or MP3 player if you've still got one. Heck, burn them onto a CD if you want. Heck, record them on a cylinder phonograph while you're at it. Now those are actual vibes. It's over, I promise. At least for this part. Of course, I was kind of limited when it came to the dimensions I had to work with, so I only made a 2-seater, but honestly, I preferred it. It was cuter, and less work. Now that both the casing and bottom half of the playset were mostly complete, it was time for the top half. Long ago, while trying to conjure up my very first liminal space project, I wanted to somehow portray a setting reminiscent of the original Backrooms photo. Of course, I ended up doing this in a roundabout way by knitting the wallpaper in vest form. But now that I had the perfect opportunity to fulfill my years-long dream of knitting the Backrooms, I'd be a fool to let such a full circle moment pass me by. You see, the shape of a keycap is actually perfect, because of a thing called the one-point perspective. If you draw or have ever looked into learning how to, you'll probably be familiar with what this is. And to get to the point, this is pretty much the perspective of the original Backrooms photo, which meant that the inside of the top half of this case was kind of perfect for replicating this look. So, without delay, I rummaged through my scrapyard of scrap yarns, which is just a bag of scraps, mind you, to find the leftover yarns I used for the vest. At first, I wanted to see how the wallpaper pattern would look crocheted, since I thought the square proportions of single crochet stitches could be easier to build with than the more rectangular knit stitches. Plus, I was hoping to avoid the difficulties of knitting, which will become clear very soon. Sadly, but conveniently, it became clear very quickly that a knit fabric was going to look much neater. So I redrafted the colorwork pattern from my first wallpaper knit, and made everything as small as I could with the pattern still being recognizable. The awkward part was that I needed to work vertically while forming diagonal top and bottom edges. I tried to see if I could just work horizontally instead, but no such luck. It was technically doable, but visually, the result would have likely been worse than not trying at all. Since the two walls in the original photo had different wallpapers, there was only one thing to do. I put together a simple polka dot-esque pattern and worked up the other side after trying a bunch of other yarn combinations. Next, I needed a carpet. Thankfully, I could work things up more normally this time. I decided to use the leftover wool from my ribbed shorts, even though it was much heavier than the yarn I used for the wallpaper panels. All this meant was spending some more time getting the stitch count right. I thought about various stitch patterns, but honestly, the pearl side of the stockinette fabric felt just right, and definitely reminded me of old school institutional carpets. Finally, I moved on to the ceiling. I needed to convey the idea of a foam-tiled ceiling with fluorescent lighting in the aforementioned one-point perspective, and after trying to knit it, I went back to crochet and used the beige cotton from my miniskirts project and some more white yarn, since it would give me as much contrast as I could reasonably get. The reason why I thought the back rooms would be a good setting for the top half of this playset is because I couldn't help but feel like the original backrooms photo was an apt metaphor for our journey from physical media to digital media, which is kind of confusing because discs are both physical and digital, but that's beside the point. It seems that despite the wide variety of liminal spaces out there, to me, nothing seems more liminal than an empty hallway or walkway. It's not only liminal by definition, but is also full of mystery, often nostalgic depending on the decor. You could say that the image of a hallway is a banal and mundane depiction of moving through life itself. You don't always know where you're going or what's going to meet you at the end, but it often feels like you've been there before. Like those of our inner worlds, the walls that guide yet confine us are papered with the past. Liminal passages also seem to offer limited choices in direction. Although we're all taught that the world is our oyster and free will is included in the package of existence, I think it's safe to say that most of us don't actually feel that way every day. We often have to remind ourselves, or rather convince ourselves otherwise. And if we get really technical, relativity would suggest that the future already exists, and we're just moving through it. So to echo the cliché, do we even have free will at all? That's enough pop science nihilism for today, because this video is about media, and how we might not have that much of a say in what we enjoy and consume after all. Or do we? You knew where this was headed. Algorithms. Sometimes I scroll through my feeds and think, wow, is this who I am? Is this a reflection of my inner world? Am I truly entertained by all of this? Honestly, probably not, a lot of the time. And the fact that I'm pretty disappointed in what's recommended to me on a daily basis gives me hope that that's the case. I know good videos are out there, but they're hard to find among the waves of content crashing in at every moment of every day, and it's not hard to feel a certain way about it. But let's be honest, if it weren't for the algorithm, we may never have crossed paths, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Not necessarily for the algorithm itself, although it does play an undeniable role, but for you. Because one day you clicked on my video for the first time with only a thumbnail and a title to go off of. More often than not, I find myself just clicking on a video I don't really want to watch, simply because it seems the best out of the bunch, which is barely saying much. And once my feed is refreshed, I inevitably receive similar suggestions to the one I just picked. As famously sung by Rockwell, I always feel like somebody's watching me, and I have no privacy. This was back in 1984. Coincidence? I don't think so. As you'll soon see, this is relevant. Naturally, I had to ask myself, where does this backroom lead to? I still wanted something within the liminal aesthetic, maybe even something dreamcore or weirdcore-esque. And then it hit me. Eye tests. You know those scenes with distant red objects the optometrist would ask you to focus on, even though there were other things in the scene that you wanted to check out, but they would get annoyed with you if you did? Well, eye test, or rather autorefractometer machine images, have been one of the more well-known staples of the online liminal space aesthetic, and it's easy to understand why. These uncannily simple yet quaint images are familiar to many of us, and most importantly, they're nostalgic. Another addition to the library of collective memories. But that's actually the more superficial part, because I realized that these scenes were an unsettling metaphor for this very subject. The feeling I had when I was little attending a routine eye test, sat on a squeaky swivel chair, chin on tearaway tissue paper, staring at the house on the horizon, was one of curiosity. I always wanted to know what the optometrist was seeing, what they were even looking to test in the first place, but it always remained a complete mystery. All I could see was the pretty picture, and nothing past it. Many years later, and now the pretty picture is a content creator, ranting about a show or movie I've seen multiple times, or how certain artists and bands were so underrated back in the day. And the optometrist? Well, they would be the AI machine. As in, am I right? I decided to embroider this part of the project using more of my scrap yarns, and needless to say, the strands were less shiny and a lot weaker than embroidery floss, but they would still get the job done. For the composition, I excavated through the crevices of my brain to try and find some clearer memories of these eye tests. With little success. Both the house and the hot air balloon felt super familiar. I remembered the white picket fence, but not how detailed the house was. I felt like I remembered the hot air balloon, but not the road that led up to it. So since I couldn't decide which one was most familiar to me, I decided to combine the two. I wanted to combine the picket fencing with the hot air balloon in the distance. It seemed to make no sense at all, but at the same time, it made every bit of sense to me. And besides, the inaccuracy was all the more meaningful. This scene would still be pleasant enough to distract me from the reality of having my eyeballs inspected. So, since eye tests aren't exactly fun, and neither is being surveilled, how does physical media miraculously save us? Well, the obvious is that no one's watching or judging us while we rewatch our favorite DVD for the nth time. Something I really noticed when I was revisiting my old CDs was that I had to remind myself that I could listen to any band or album as much as I wanted to, even if I wasn't all that into the music anymore, without having to worry about how it would affect the algorithm, my recommendations, my feeds, or even my end-of-year review, which never failed to fill me with a cocktail of shock, disbelief, denial, and suspicion. Because I will not be gaslighted into believing that those were really my top songs of the year. As I changed CDs, I realized that I was free. There was nothing keeping tabs on my listening behavior, or calculating what I would listen to next. I could put the most annoying songs on repeat, and nothing bad would come of it. If I had the Crazy Frog CD, I would have played it. And this kind of made me sad. I had no idea I'd felt so restricted for so long, and in a way, I mourned the hours of what could have been. Hours that could have been filled with intense mediocrity, with songs and genres I kind of hated, but also kind of liked. In other words, to be more precise, the guilty pleasures of 2000s TV pop. Are the girls allowed, or are the girls allowed? To this day, I still don't know what a bugle is, but whatever video did to the radio star, corporate algorithms have done to the monoculture we once shared. Maybe this is just me, but I don't think it's just me. When it comes to physical media, I don't think it ends there. Because when I think back to the time before streaming took over, there were some really great memories connected to certain albums and movies. I have really fond memories of people recommending them to me, and plenty more of watching or listening to them. There's a three-dimensional quality to these memories, versus the somewhat two-dimensional ones of strictly digital media. It sounds dramatic, but even living room decor was such a big part of this. The warmth of our homes before minimalism took over is something I'll always regret losing. The television was a place, not an application. The sofa, a teleportation device / time machine. Our tastes were shaped by those around us, where we lived, our activities, so on and so forth. The same does still ring true for online communities. We have to admit that algorithms have helped us to find each other, especially when there's a good chance we never would have in the physical world. What I'm saying is that yes, algorithms have done so much for us that we could have never even imagined not that long ago. But it's hard to ignore the downsides, the isolation, the echo chambers, or quite frankly, the total invasion and destruction of privacy. Scrolling through these entertainment platform feeds may as well be walking down a single, narrow hallway. A better balance is possible, and maybe physical media plays a part in that. It goes without saying that I also wanted to include something interactive in this scene, and I'd always imagined a doorway at the center of this perspective, since mysterious doorways are quite a common theme in the backgrounds. Initially, I thought a brown wooden door made sense with the surrounding colors. It would also give an outdated vibe, but most of all, it would say, unmistakably, door. But then I realized, this was an escape key. So surely the appropriate barrier in this case would be a fire escape. But then I also realized that a fire escape within the initial escape, i.e. the escape key, would surely cancel out the first escape, meaning that escaping the backrooms through the fire escape would lead you to the hot air balloon, which would mean escaping into the algorithm, which is another thing you're trying to escape from. So the moral of the story is that there is no escape. I ended up using some of the same yarn from my last project as well as a slip stitch rib to crochet each door. This made sure that they were sturdy and held their shape well. The fiddliest part was including the push handle mechanism, but the green signage was simple and I duplicate stitched it as you would with a knit stockinette fabric. I actually used embroidery floss this time because the colour was a much better match than my green yarns. You know it's a simulation when the fire escape doors say pull to open, or in this case, they say nothing at all. I'm totally aware that things are slightly off-center here, but I wanted to frame the image a little better, so it is lower on purpose. It was finally time to put everything together, and I'll be honest, I was not looking forward to it. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew it was going to come together no matter what, but I had yet to find out how well it would work. First off, I needed to fill in the bottom half with some kind of stuffing. I decided that this was the perfect opportunity to use up a bunch of the yarn ends I'd cut and saved over the course of this channel's existence. I had been waiting so long to find a use for this textile waste, and filling a nostalgia-themed project with literal nostalgia material was yet another matter I was not going to miss. Now, when it came to sticking everything together, I was very apprehensive, to say the least. Why? Because I didn't have any double-sided tape, which was my ideal choice, and stitching alone just wasn't going to cut it this time. What I did have was some craft glue, the kind I assume you can eat because it's non-toxic, but of course I wasn't going to do that, unless we're speaking figuratively, in which case there was a chance I was going to eat it. In the bad way, not the good one. Preparing myself to glue my painstakingly knit and crocheted pieces to the foam actually turned out to be the hardest part. I'd completely forgotten what the wonders of craft glue can do. Everything went so quickly, which, having made every single stitch and seam by hand on this channel, felt almost surreal.
I've already steamed this, so it is a bit neater than before, but I'm hoping everything will sit properly.
Of course it was kind of messy, and it felt pretty gross, but it was familiar. The nostalgia truly was inescapable. Other than this case, is there a solid case for physical media? Yes, despite how ephemeral or inconvenient it may be. After all, the inconveniences of making this playset/diorama have made it all the more meaningful to me. Whereas digital media offers the illusion of escape, physical media and its limitations are inherently liminal. It allows us to escape for hours, away from prying eyes. In practical terms, I plan to use this case as storage for my knitting and crochet tools. It certainly has pincushion potential. I think I can finally say that our experiences of media are reflected and contained in this small yet massive escape key. After all, the key is to escape, even if, all the while, someone sits behind a machine and watches our every move. Remember, Big Brother is watching you.